Thank you for tuning into From the Cowboy State podcast. This is episode number 5. Today we have got Barton Stam from Hot Springs County, Thermopolis, Wyoming. I'm going to turn it over to him and let him introduce himself.
Well, thank you, Michaela. Yeah, I've been with the University of Wyoming, based here in Thermopolis, Wyoming since 2004. Before that, I was actually a student at Utah State University and have been here ever since. I work mostly with range management issues around the western part of Wyoming, working mostly with livestock producers on grazing management issues, natural resources, and a few other topics that come up.
That's great. So you were born and raised in Utah or just went to Utah State?
I just went to Utah State.
Okay.
I was actually born and raised in Oregon.
Oh, wow.
And then I moved to Logan, Utah to go to school because I was actually working in the summertime with the U.S. Forest Service in range management. And one of the guys there just happened to say that Utah State was a good school for range management.
Right.
I kind of took his word for it and moved there and signed up.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you've been working with University of Wyoming Extension since 2004.
Yes.
Did I get that right?
Yep.
So how have you seen it change since then? Not a loaded question.
Well, now that I've been here for 20 years, I've seen some colleagues who I also consider friends, come and go. We've been through some good times financially and some bad times financially. We've had periods of time where if someone retired or resigned, we didn't replace them.
Right.
And so when I first started here, there were quite a few of us that were involved in range management and that had a specific focus or specialty in range management and grazing issues. And those numbers have really dwindled.
Yeah.
And UW Extension's kind of changed their model too. I mean, we have, instead of hiring folks with a real specialty to work in multi-county areas, where a lot of our more recent hires are more county focused. Mm-hmm. Those have probably been the biggest changes, is like sort of a lack of colleagues anymore that are specializing in range. And that's also, maybe it's a sad thing, but that's also presented me with more opportunities
Absolutely.
To work in that field. So that's kind of some of the big changes with UW Extension I've seen. But I think we're in a pretty good place right now in terms of getting some more people back on board, and there's still quite a bit of support for me to go out and do range management work that I'm grateful for.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's been nice for me too. So being located up in Park County and you're in Hot Springs, just south of or southeast of, it's been nice to be able to learn what some of the specialists on campus are doing, because before coming into this role, personally, I couldn't have told you a whole lot about range management. So it's been nice to learn in a short amount of time what you've worked on, which we're going to dive into a little bit later, but what you've worked on, other specialists have worked on, those tools that you guys have developed, which Jedediah mentioned in this previous podcast, the range management tools, great to utilize for measuring a multitude of different things, just whether it's your backyard, your pasture, what have you. So those tools are really helpful. And yeah, I came in not knowing much of anything about that. So that's been great to learn from.
Yeah.
So we talked about how you came to work for University of Wyoming Extension, a little bit about that background. Time for the traditional question on the podcast. What does agriculture mean to you, Barton?
To me, agriculture means the production of food and fiber to feed and clothe humankind.
Yeah.
And it's an absolutely critical, without agriculture, there wouldn't be any people on this earth.
Absolutely.
And to me, it's a really special part of our world that needs and deserves a lot of respect and our care and attention, so that we're responsibly and sustainably providing for the needs of humankind.
And I think 2 key points there were responsibly and sustainably. Mm-hmm. So I appreciate you.
And part of that also includes agricultural producers being able to do it in a profitable manner. Because I mean, the fact of life is, if they can't support themselves and they can't support their operations and be profitable, they wouldn't exist.
Absolutely.
And sometimes that might sound like a dirty word, but it's not. Like, they have to be profitable so that they can provide the food and fiber that we all use.
Yeah. Well, and just we don't want them to have to be forced to sell out and sell to those subdivided
Right.
subdivisions we're seeing pop up, for me personally, between Powell and Cody, and even north of Powell now. You don't want to see that everywhere. We want to see those families in multi-generational opportunities or multi-generational operations continue on.
Right. Yeah, our agricultural lands are important for much more than just the food and fiber they produce. I mean, open space, wildlife habitat, water and soil conservation. It just, I mean, view sheds now, I think is the word. I mean, it just goes on and on, that the value that they provide to society, those values either disappear or are diminished if those farms and ranches disappear.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's jump into what we alluded to earlier, your projects. What are some of the bigger projects that you've been working on lately?
So in the past, one that I've been working on for probably about 7 or 8 years now has been a project actually on the Bighorn Forest, where we've had a research project up there where we've been looking at the method of monitoring up there called the Robel poll. And I've had a pretty big partner with Dr. Derek Skasta on campus, who's our state range specialist. And then the U.S. Forest Service has been a partner. And then some Forest Service livestock grazing permittees, so ranchers that graze livestock on the forest have been a partner with us as well. And then we've also had some funding from private groups like Guardians of the Range, and also the state program called RHAP, which Rangeland Health Assessment Program. We also got some funding from, and we also got some funding from the Ag Experiment Station with the University of Wyoming as well.
All right.
And that's an ongoing research project that we're working on. That's been a big one, consumed a lot of our time. And then another one that's really been enjoyable for me is kind of what I call a targeted grazing project on the Sunlight Wildlife Habitat Management area up north of Cody. So kind of between Cody and Cook City, Montana.
Okay.
It's been a really fun project up there.
Neat. So how did, I guess, both, or if you just want to highlight one other, whichever, how did these projects come about? And how does this really fit into your role being a rangeland management specialist with UWE?
Sure. So on the targeted grazing project up in Sunlight, I had been working with one of the livestock producers up there who owns and manages a cattle ranch up there.
Okay.
And that cattle ranch is typical of quite a few Western ranches where some of the lands are private.
Okay.
And some of the lands they graze on are public lands, so they
Right.
have grazing allotments on the U.S. Forest Service as well. And I'd worked with him on a variety of issues, but one that sort of came up was adjacent to some of his property in Sunlight is some property that the Wyoming Game and Fish owns, and that's called the Sunlight Wildlife Habitat Management Area. And I'm sure that the Game and Fish would probably want to refine my definition of what that is a little bit, and I would certainly defer to them on that. But one of the goals of that property is to provide wintering habitat for elk. So it's surrounded by the mountains. It's really not that far from Yellowstone Park.
Right.
Especially as elk migrate, it's really not that far.
Right.
And one of the issues that this livestock producer was having was the elk weren't utilizing the habitat management area. And if they did come down, they were crossing the creek and going straight onto his private lands to graze. And so we wondered, were there ways that we could influence that and change or improve the habitat area so that it would be more appealing to the elk?
So I was just going to say, and I was lucky enough to tag along with you one of the times, well, this was 2 or 3 months ago at this point now.
Yep.
And you were talking to me, you were walking me through the project and looping me in on everything. And one of the things that you had mentioned when you were walking me through this whole regenerative grazing section of the project is you mentioned that, cattle have great protein detectors. As we know, you turn them out, they know where to go to graze. Elk, you said, definitely have better protein detectors. And then you had alluded to a study, I think that you had read, or maybe the rancher that you're working with had read, something along those lines. But can you talk about that a little bit more in depth?
Yeah, so I think clear back when I was in school at Utah State, I had heard about sort of a similar situation that had happened in Montana, where there had been a private ranch that had been grazed by cattle. And of course, it was surrounded or neighbored other ranches that grazed cattle. But this one particular ranch changed ownership, and it went from being a privately owned ranch with livestock production on it to being owned by the Montana, and now I can't remember exactly what they call themselves, but the Montana version of the Game and Fish. And this was clear back in the 60s or 70s. And they had, once it had changed hands and gone from private ownership to owned by the state of Montana, essentially, the livestock production on it was removed because their goal had been, instead of raising cattle on there, their goal was to provide habitat for elk.
Right.
Well, what happened soon afterwards was the elk, within a few years, stopped using that property. I mean, there were elk that went, through it or whatever, but the elk started focusing using the neighboring lands that still had livestock production on them. And so what had basically been figured out from that and from some other studies, both before and after, was that elk really prefer, like you said, they have protein detectors. Like they're just like you and I. They want food that's highly palatable.
Right.
And cattle are the same way. So in this case up in Montana, the grass was allowed on that ranch. It was allowed to grow every year, and there's really no pressure on that grass.
Okay.
Which sounds great, and oftentimes rest or deferment from grazing is a tool we'll use to recover certain landscapes. But it can also the pendulum of that can swing too far. And so when you get forages that go too long without some sort of disturbance, which could be grazing, it could be a fire, it could even be mowing, those grasses tend to get pretty coarse and unpalatable. And so instead of having fresh, succulent, palatable grasses, you have multiple years of old grasses that builds up and up and up. And it doesn't become, I mean, it's still grazable.
Right.
But if you're an elk and you can pretty much go anywhere you want to, I mean, with some limitations on the landscape, you're going to choose those areas that have palatable grasses instead of unpalatable. And also that can mean more nutritious grasses. So in this case in Montana, they eventually started going to the neighboring ranches where there was still cattle production and possibly some haying operations. So what that means is instead of the grasses being allowed to get old and coarse every year, the cattle on those ranches, because the cattle don't have the ability to leave a pasture like an elk does. And so those cattle were setting those grasses back every year and keeping those grasses on those neighboring ranches more palatable and more nutritious. And at some point, the folks that were managing that property in Montana realized what was going on.
Right.
And amidst quite a bit of controversy, they put cattle back on the Game and Fish property.
Okay.
But they didn't just turn them out willy-nilly and just say, have at it.
Yeah.
They were in a well-managed grazing program up there, meant to provide yes, some disturbance on the grasses, but also for the ability for those grasses to reproduce, protect the soil, protect the water resources, but not get to the point to where the grasses were so unpalatable. And the elk started reusing that property again because now the grasses are more nutritious and palatable to them. Again, once more. And then there's also been some other studies done about using livestock grazing, cattle in particular, to improve elk habitat. And in fact, our college dean, Kelly Crane, did some work on one of those studies as well that we kind of used, that we also kind of used to help guide us in this project. So our project wasn't really so much of a study because kind of the research had already kind of been done.
Sure.
It was more like, let's just apply some of the lessons that these other studies and other projects have kind of led the way on.
Absolutely.
Back to this situation in Sunlight. Over a few years, myself and the livestock producer approached the game and fish personnel to see what their thoughts would be on doing something very similar as putting livestock grazing back on this habitat area that's owned by the game and fish. It took a few years, not so much because anybody disagreed with us or thought we were wrong. It just sometimes these things take a little time to get
naturally
put into action. And so starting in late spring, early summer of 2023, we started grazing that Sunlight habitat management area with yearling steers. And once again, we didn't just turn animals out
and just let them wander all over.
Right. Because if we had done that wouldn't have been that much of an improvement if we had just let those animals pick and choose where they graze, that really isn't that much of an improvement.
Sure.
So,
that defeats the purpose.
Right.
Yeah.
Now there's a couple of questions I get about this is, one, why did we use yearling steers as opposed to like old mother cows, which might be better technically for trying to reduce old growth in the forages.
Sure.
But really it came down to a matter of we needed a fairly high number of cattle and we needed them close by. And so this livestock producer, that's what he raises or he runs is yearling steers that he buys in the winter and spring, runs them throughout the summer and early fall, and then sells them. So really the matter of why we used yearling steers is because that's what we had available.
Fair enough. Whatever works.
Right.
Yeah.
And so when we turned them out on this habitat area, they were put into temporary pastures or paddocks that were set up using temporary electric fencing.
Okay.
So our goal there was to reduce the cattle's ability to be selective. We really wanted them to, as much as we could, we wanted them to sort of uniformly take the old forages out.
Right.
With the idea that by doing that, we would stimulate the new growth to come up and therefore provide more palatable and more nutritious forages that would be more attractive to the elk, so that the elk would, when they do come down off the mountains, that they would spend more time on the wildlife habitat management area and less time on the adjacent private lands,
right,
or also some other private lands that would be further down out of the mountains.
Taking that pressure off of those ranchers there.
Right.
Now, is there any irrigation set up on those?
On the habitat management
area? Thank you. Yep.
Yeah, that was one of the really cool things about this is that, so Wyoming's a pretty dry state.
Yes. Very.
And that area of the state, it gets a fair amount of snow and some rain. It's certainly not the driest part of the state, but one of the coolest things that are really one of the most convenient things about this project was that there were already center pivot irrigation set up on the habitat management area. And another very fortunate thing was that some of the employees that worked on the ranch have extensive pivot experience because the ranch also uses center pivot irrigation. So this provided a number of really helpful things for us on this project. One, after the cattle grazed a certain area and we moved them off, because we didn't keep them in any one area. So we grazed almost 1,000 head of steers in relatively small areas, but probably the longest they were ever in one pasture at a time was a day and a half, maybe close to 2 days, and then they were moved. And so once they were moved and off a piece, the irrigation was turned back on, and that allowed that really stimulated the grasses to regrow, which is what you want. You want that regrowth. The other thing that really helped us out was one of the difficulties when you're trying to intensively manage grazing of livestock is how are you going to water them? Moving water around is tough. And so, but with these center pivot irrigations, we basically had a ready supply of water.
Okay.
So with some somewhat movable water troughs, these center pivot irrigation systems supplied the water for the livestock as well.
That's great.
So that really was, it really was an ideal set of circumstances to have a livestock producer immediately adjacent that had the available cattle, that had the experience with intensively managing cattle grazing, and had the experience to work with center pivot irrigation. It's not, it really pays to have some experience with that equipment.
No, absolutely. That's not something that you just walk into and decide to do one day and it happens a week later,
Right.
That's, yeah. So I want to backtrack a little bit because you've mentioned working with a cattle ranch manager and his staff. You've mentioned working with U.S. Forest Service.
Yeah.
And then, a few other entities. So can we talk about what has your experience been like working with these different offices, external partners, etc.? Or how have you worked with these offices in the past? Yeah,
so a lot of those partners that I work with the main ones be the U.S. Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, that we also shortened to BLM.
Yep.
And then Game and Fish, NRCS, and there's been some others. Wildlife Services is also one. I don't know if they'd always say they'd enjoy working with me, but I really enjoy working with other professionals. Probably one of my favorite things, this might sound a little weird, but probably one of my favorite things is when I work with somebody else and we can have a professional relationship to the point where we might disagree with each other.
Sure.
But we can still work together. When we might disagree about one thing,
right?
But we probably agree about a whole bunch of others. Or we might disagree on how we're going to get somewhere, but we have an end goal in common.
Absolutely.
And if you have mutual respect and you're both sides or all parties are professional, you can usually work through those. And so I've had the chance to work with professionals in all those groups I named that have been just the consummate professionals that can work together towards a common goal, even if we disagree about something. And that brings up a pretty good point because the livestock producer in this situation where we're talking about the targeted grazing, there's been some conflict on some other issues with the game and fish. Livestock predation is one of them. And so there's been some conflict, but that doesn't mean that on this issue that we have a common goal that we can't work together. And so I've really appreciated that opportunity with our game and fish partners and the livestock producer on that one. Now, I'm not going to try to sugarcoat everything and say that it's always, kumbaya.
Everyone's best friends
right.
all the time.
Because that's not the case.
Yeah.
I'm sure that some people in those agencies would probably had heartburn over working with me sometime, and the vice versa is true as well.
Sure.
But the vast majority of the time, it's just a really enjoyable experience to work with other people, in both in the private industry and in those sort of federal and state agencies as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the quote I hear most often is, you don't have to like everybody, but you just have to work together,
right.
Get the job done.
Yep.
It happens.
Yep. And I've been in I've seen some conflicts where, it's gotten to the point of like lawsuit type conflict.
Sure.
Where we're in court. Then when we get back on the ground and we're trying to work towards a problem, and even in the courtroom, there's still very much a mutual respect. Both sides are working hard. Both sides are trying to get a job done and accomplish a goal, but we disagree on an issue. So it definitely happens, but it's part of the job, I guess, in natural resources, probably in all industries, where you have to be professional, you have to be respectful. Know that the other person isn't just out to get you or out to do something wrong.
Oh, absolutely. So, as you mentioned earlier, you've been in your role for 20 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
For quite a while. And so it seems like you have these, like I said, foundational relationships. You know a lot of people, you've been in this area and are working on these unique projects. And so Barton's working on this regenerative grazing thing. Your Bighorn Mountain project, was that the other one that you mentioned?
The Bighorn Forest, yeah.
The Bighorn Forest project, exactly. But you've worked really hard to make these connections. And you're out in the field all the time. You were a liaison for Bridger for something earlier in the year. I can't remember what he was having you work with donors on for something. Not to get into the weeds on that, but my point is, you've worked really hard to make these connections. So there's a whole group of us that are coming up in this A&R field. Is there any advice that you would give to us who have been in this, role for 5 years or less, give or take?
I think probably the biggest piece of advice is that it's not easy to be technically good in your field, but almost anyone can learn the nuts and bolts of your subject area. For some personalities, it's harder, probably for most personalities, it's harder to build those significant relationships with people, especially where, like we were talking about earlier, you might be disagreeing with them.
Sure.
But I think being willing to being willing to build relationships and spend time building relationships and demonstrate mutual respect and be willing to learn from other people. I could sit here and say, well, I've been doing this for 20 years, but I have colleagues that have been doing it for a lot longer than that.
Yeah.
And there's plenty I can learn from someone who just got here, too. And there's plenty I can learn from someone who's in a different agency.
Right.
And so being able to learn from others, build those relationships, and be honest. When I was a brand new extension educator, I really wanted to, and I still do, but I really wanted to make a good impression. And when it seemed like one of the worst things to do would be like, if someone asks you a question and you don't know what it is,
right,
you want to sort of make up an answer.
Yeah, I know that. Yeah.
But like, that's the worst thing you can do. If you're sitting there making up an answer and you don't know it,
right?
And I did it. We probably have all done it. I mean, if you're talking to a farmer or rancher or even a homeowner that has a yard and garden question, and you're trying to make up an answer, like, they usually see through that.
Yeah.
They respect you so much more if you're able to say something along the lines of, I don't know.
I have no idea. Yeah.
But you follow that up with, but we'll figure this out.
Yep.
And then you actually do that.
And
like, you go back to that person and figure it out. And one of the really cool things about working in the university system is that there are so many resources.
Yeah.
We have so many colleagues that might know the answer or that probably do know the answer.
Yeah.
And that's another thing I really like about it. And that what I would advise newer folks is to not be afraid to utilize, not just newer folks, all of us, to not be afraid to utilize these resources that are out there. That just makes it so much better than trying to come up with an answer that's not really an answer. Pull something out of the air.
Yeah. Yeah, I will say that's taken me, so I started in February, that's taken me a little bit to get comfortable with, because I think it is intimidating to come into, like you said, this huge university system where everybody does have their specialty, and it seems that everybody knows a lot about a lot. And like you've said, nobody started out that way. Well, they may have had a specialty, they got their master's in range management or livestock, or it didn't start out that way. And so it's intimidating to take that first step of sending that email or making that call of, hey, I need help with this. Yeah. But luckily everybody is so welcoming, and it is easy to, once you take that first step, to take that first jump, and then so on and so forth. It's been easy to get there. It just takes a second.
Right.
But
And I think another big thing about that, along with the relationships, is it's important to me to be part of the community that I'm in. And I don't just mean the town of Thermopolis or the county of Hot Springs. To be at things like Wyoming Stock Growers Association or the wool growers, or to have been at the Sheep and Wool Festival that we had here in Thermopolis. People see you out there and you're talking to them, you're building relationships with them, you're finding out their needs, and then you're doing something about some of those needs that you have the ability to address. Every once in a while, I'll be gone out of my office. Well, not every once in a while. I'm gone out of my office all the time. But every once in a while, when I am gone out of my office, somebody will, someone calls and I'm not here. And most people understand that, but sometimes there's been a complaint like, well, you're not even in your office. Well, of course, there's work that requires me to be in my office, but there's so much work that I can't do sitting in my chair.
Yeah.
And so not being afraid to get out there and meet people, being part of the community, we've got county fairs coming up, at least being visible at those. I'm not the biggest fair person. I'm basically useless when it comes to showing livestock. But I get so much value out of being at our county fair because it's an opportunity to network with people and to get to know them. And honestly, it can be a good needs assessment time because it's a chance to talk to people and they can tell you what some of their needs might be that you or I or the extension system could help them with.
Absolutely. That's so Park County's fair is this week. We had 4-H judging yesterday. Today's the unload and weigh-in day. And then I'm in the swine barn tomorrow. But no, just like what you're saying, we did a 4-H program, a photography program earlier in the year. And then some of those 4-H kids and moms, parents that brought their kids to that program, I already saw again yesterday. And they started making that connection of, oh, this is Michaela, the A&R extension educator, and it's just starting to make that connections and everything, and more with those folks in the community. Some of the irrigation district managers are there, and just like you're talking about.
So one of our big stakeholder groups is the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, and they meet twice a year. And at those meetings, we try to provide some service like recording the committee meeting minutes. Yeah. And that's an important service, but what I really find important is the same thing about being there is the chance to network with those livestock producers and the agency personnel that attend the same meeting. Yeah. And that to me is the real value to be there at that meeting is a chance to network, assess their needs, help them out. They can help me out quite a bit too. Yeah. Those are important events to be at. And sometimes the best benefit of being there isn't exactly because of the meeting, but it's because of the networking opportunities.
I took notes at the summer meeting for the public and private lands meeting. And so, they go over previous motions and everything like that, make new motions, what have you. And one of the new things that was put into effect, I guess people are having issues of tourists, there it is, I was like, not pedestrians, tourists riding their electric bikes on private lands to go hunting, and then they are hauling the deer, antelope, whatever they shoot, out on the electric bikes.
As a way to sneak them out?
As a way to sneak them out, because you hear a side-by-side or an ATV, or a truck, what have you. You don't hear an electric bike. So that was a new thing that was put into their laws, their commandments, what have you, was to rule out the electric bikes, because that's been, I guess, such an issue. A guy actually caught on camera someone hauling out an antelope on an electric bike. And you would just never think that would be. It's like, I was so happy. I was like trying to type, but at the same time, I'm just like, you would never,
Yeah, and so if you hadn't have been at that meeting,
Yeah,
you might not still know about it.
No, I would never know, but that's also something, though, I can take back to Park County and be like, okay, so
Yeah.
just so we know. Yeah. Goodness. Okay, so next question for you. Your most memorable project throughout the years. Good, bad, either or.
So there's a livestock producer here in the state that underwent a huge amount of conflict with a public land agency to the point of, there were court cases involved and losing grazing permits. And, I played a relatively small role in this process, but even playing a small role, eventually we got, or the ranch got their grazing permits back. And not only that, but the relationship with the public land agency improved greatly. I mean, it turned to 180. And that didn't happen overnight. I mean, it was years, right? But seeing that all happen and seeing, livestock return to those allotments, seeing the working relationships improve, that's probably been one of my most memorable experiences. That was, a multi-year, lots of stress, lots of, conflict, arguments, but then moving from that to successfully working together for sustainable, profitable livestock production, but also natural resource management. That's really been a meaningful project that I got to be a small part of. Yeah.
That seems like it would be in kind of an all-encompassing of your role too.
Yeah.
That's neat.
Yeah, that I'll look back on that probably for a long time and just kind of. And there's been others too, but that one really kind of stands out to me because, it went from just really, really bad.
Yeah.
To it's a dang good working relationship now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's neat to hear. How long ago was that?
Oh, it was going on in the 90s.
Oh, wow.
And
okay.
Then, but it's been a good, solid working relationship now for probably 5-6 years now.
Right.
Yeah. It was a long term. It started before I came here, and through the efforts of the livestock producer and different and new people that worked for the public land agency and others, it changed, and really for the benefit of everyone involved.
That's great. So my last question before we close out, if you had to give any advice to your younger self starting in this role, which you kind of already touched on a little bit, but if, you had to give any advice to your younger self, what would it be?
I think if I had to give myself from 20 years ago advice, one piece of advice would be to not be afraid to take credit for a successful project that I had worked on. I think a lot of times as educators, we want to be modest or we don't want to brag about work we've done. But in our system of evaluation, it's important for us as University of Wyoming Extension educators to take credit for good work that we've done. This helps show our supervisors and our colleagues what we've been doing. And that becomes especially important when it's time for promotions or maybe even a pay raise. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't recognize partners or collaborators that have worked on a good project with us, because we certainly want to recognize their efforts as well. But we need to make sure, especially as newer educators, that we take our proper credit for a successful project or program that we've worked on.
I don't know if that's a good answer or not. But.
No, that is, yeah. I'm just going to take some notes over here. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So any upcoming events? I know you mentioned County Fair. Any other upcoming events, programs, what have you?
Well, it's not necessarily upcoming because the Wyoming Ranch Camp,
Yes.
I would like to mention. So that normally happens in June, so it kind of just happened. It's really kind of a year-long effort where we try to market it and recruit. The Wyoming Ranch Camp was started our first one was in 2021. We had tried to do 2020, but COVID stopped that.
Sure.
And what the Wyoming Ranch Camp is we go to a host ranch and we spend 5 days there with our participant, our students. And our target audience for our students is really a college age young adults, but they need to be 18 or older to come. But we have had some much older than traditional college age students come as well. And our class is normally limited to about 15 to 16 students. And we stay at a ranch and we work with that ranch on teaching these students about ranching and livestock production and natural resource management. One thing that I want to clear up about Wyoming Ranch Camp is not a dude camp.
No, it's not.
Yeah, so I've talked to some young adults that have been involved in agriculture and said, "Hey, you should come to ranch camp," and they've kind of looked at me like, "I don't need ranch camp," and I think it's because they view it as a dude camp.
Well, and I think there's some photos of y'all branding, but just because there's a branding portion, that's just one aspect, because when you manage cattle, most people brand their cattle.
Right.
However, that is one small section. There's so much more that goes into it.
Oh, yeah. We talk about ag economics. We talk about the specifics of managing that ranch. You know, the ranches we've gone to have been involved in multiple business enterprises besides just livestock production.
Yeah.
So energy, recreation, hunting. Those are huge aspects to ranch management.
Sure.
So I really want people out there that hear about Wyoming Ranch Camp to view Wyoming Ranch Camp as more of a valuable extension program. It just happens to be a multi-day event where we don't really...
Takes place on a ranch.
Yeah, it takes place at a ranch where we stay there.
Yeah.
Because we have had those students come that have never even touched a head of livestock. But we've also had students come that are, from legacy family operations.
Yeah.
And they've all seen some value to coming.
And this past year, or I guess just a few months ago, last month, you had a really great segment about ranch leadership, ranch management and leadership. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. So,
which is, I think, invaluable.
Yeah. So on these ranches we go to, we have their management team be part of the class, and they do quite a bit of the instructing. So we do have those hands-on things like branding and stocking, but there's a lot of time spent with the management teams on these ranches where they talk about things like recruiting employees, employee retention, the management facets to a ranch that are besides building fence or trailing cattle, the finances, the leases, the agreements. It's almost infinite, the problems that these management teams deal with.
Yeah.
And so that's really kind of the focus of ranch camp, is to get students, and they, like I said, they might have lots of experience or they might have no experience, but we can still expose them to the management strategies and to the realities of managing these. While they're with us for a week, we split them up into groups, and they come up with a sort of a proposal of an enterprise for the ranch, and they present it to a panel of judges at the end. Okay. It's kind of a competition for them as well, a friendly competition. But it's been a great experience. We have some videos that we can share about Wyoming Ranch Camp, and I know it's a long ways away, but if there's someone that's interested in either hosting a ranch camp in the future, contributing financially to Wyoming Ranch Camp, or especially someone who's interested in attending ranch camp, I'll take every opportunity I can to try to get the word out.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right. Well, University of Wyoming Extension Ranch Camp, just under a year from now, and that all of that information is on the University of Wyoming Extension website. And as time gets closer, more updated info will come out. But if you're interested in being the host ranch, reach out to Barton.
Yeah, that'd work.
Yep. And Barton, what's your email address or phone number, whatever's best?
Yeah, so my email is brstam@uwyo.edu. And of course, they can also find that on the University of Wyoming Extension webpage as well. And my
Perfect.
phone number, which is 307-864-3421.
Perfect. So this has been episode 5 of From the Cowboy State podcast, a University of Wyoming Extension Agriculture and Natural Resources podcast. I'm your host, Michaela Getz, and we were joined today by Barton Stam. As a reminder, this is a University of Wyoming Extension podcast. The university is committed to equal opportunity for all persons in all facets of the university's operations and is an equal opportunity / affirmative action employer. If you have any questions, comments, concerns about this statement, please don't hesitate to reach out to mgetz@uwyo.edu. and we can get your questions answered. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns about the podcast as well, again, don't hesitate to reach out to that email address, mgetz@uwyo.edu. Again, this has been a University of Wyoming Extension Agriculture and Natural Resources podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in.